Margaret Chen stood in her spotless kitchen, watching the steam rise from her famous apple cinnamon scones. At 74, her hands still moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting every recipe, every fold of dough, every measured teaspoon. The morning light filtered through the bay window she had installed herself 30 years ago, casting golden rectangles across the marble countertops that had been her 70th birthday gift to herself. She had no idea that in exactly 47 days, those same hands would be signing documents that would reduce her son and daughter-in-law's net worth to negative $63,000. She had no idea that the woman upstairs, blow-drying her hair in Margaret's guest bathroom, would soon be begging for mercy that would never come. But first, there were scones to finish. There were always scones to finish. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Margaret Chen had built her life on precision and kindness. In that exact order. The precision came from 35 years as a certified public accountant for mid-sized businesses in Dallas, Texas. The kindness came from somewhere deeper, somewhere her late husband David used to say was pure gold wrapped in Texas grit. Their Victorian home on Maple Street had been their pride and joy. 4 bedrooms, wrap-around porch, and a kitchen that had hosted countless holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet Tuesday night meals, where David would read the newspaper aloud while Margaret prepped vegetables for the next day's clients. David had been gone 3 years now, a sudden heart attack at 68, leaving Margaret with a house that echoed and a retirement account that didn't. But she had managed. She always managed. The life insurance had been substantial. The mortgage was paid off. And her consulting work with small businesses kept both her mind sharp and her bank account healthy. When her son Bradley called in early September, his voice tight with that particular strain she'd learned to recognize as financial stress, Margaret didn't hesitate. "Mom, I hate to ask this," Bradley had said, and she could picture him in his cramped apartment across town, probably pacing while his wife Jessica scrolled through her phone in the background. "But we're in a bit of a bind. Jessica's boutique isn't taking off as fast as we hoped, and the rent on our place just went up again." Margaret had stirred her evening tea slowly, buying herself time to think. Bradley was 32, old enough to have learned better money management, but young enough that she still felt responsible for his mistakes. Jessica was 28. Beautiful in that high-maintenance way that required constant investment, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. "What kind of bind, sweetheart? We might lose the apartment, and Jessica's pregnant again." The tea had gone cold in her hands. Another grandchild. The first one, little Emma, was barely 2 years old, and already showing signs of the Chen family stubbornness. Margaret had been hoping Bradley and Jessica would wait, would get their finances stable, and maybe move somewhere more affordable. But hope and reality rarely shook hands in her experience. "How much do you need?" "It's not about money, Mom." "Well, not exactly. We were wondering. You have all that space, and we'd only need a couple of months to get back on our feet. Jessica's been looking at some really promising locations for a second boutique, and I'm up for a promotion at the firm." Margaret had learned long ago that when someone said it wasn't about money, it was always about money. "You want to move in here?" "Just temporarily." 3 months. Maybe 4. And we'd help with expenses, of course. Groceries, utilities. It would actually save you money, too. She had said yes because she was 71 years old and tired of eating dinner alone. She had said yes because Emma deserved to know her grandmother. She had said yes because Bradley was her only child, and Jessica was carrying her second grandchild, and the family was supposed to help the family. She should have said no. The first week had been almost pleasant. Jessica had cooed over Margaret's china collection and asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood. Bradley had helped move furniture around to make space for Emma's portable crib and toys. They'd shared meals and watched television together, and Margaret had allowed herself to believe that maybe this arrangement could work. The changes started small. Jessica moved Margaret's reading chair from the living room to make space for a modern sectional sofa she'd ordered online. "It's just more practical for a family with small children," she'd explained, her smile bright and reasonable. Your chair was beautiful, but not exactly child-safe with all those wooden edges. Margaret had found her chair relegated to the basement, dusty and forgotten between Christmas decorations and boxes of David's old files. She'd wiped it clean and tried to convince herself that Jessica was right about child safety. Next came the kitchen. Jessica was particular about organic foods, non-toxic cleaning supplies, and what she called a, quote, curated aesthetic. Margaret's collection of mismatched coffee mugs, each one a memory from a vacation or gift from a client, disappeared into storage, replaced by a set of pristine white ceramic cups that looked like they belonged in a catalog. I hope you don't mind, Jessica had said, not sounding like she cared whether Margaret minded or not. I just thought it would be nice to update things a bit. Make them more cohesive. Margaret had minded, but she'd learned that minding out loud led to Jessica's particular brand of passive-aggressive warfare, the martyred sighs. The comments about how hard it was to live with someone from a different generation. The way she'd suddenly become very busy whenever Margaret needed help with Emma. By the third week, Margaret's morning routine had been completely disrupted. Jessica needed the kitchen early to prepare Emma's breakfast, special organic oatmeal that had to be made fresh each morning. Margaret's traditional coffee and toast were pushed later and later until she found herself eating a hurried breakfast while Jessica bustled around, reorganizing cabinets and muttering about how much clutter accumulated in older homes. I don't know how you found anything in here, Jessica had said one morning, elbow deep in Margaret's spice cabinet. Some of these are expired by years. It's actually kind of concerning from a health perspective. Margaret had watched her cumin and paprika, spices she'd bought just months before, disappear into Jessica's donation bag. When she'd protested mildly that the spices were still good, Jessica had given her a look of patient condescension that felt like being patted on the head. Mom, Bradley had said later, using the tone reserved for explaining complex concepts to children, Jessica's just trying to help. She knows about these things. Her whole business is about health and wellness. Quote. Jessica's business, as far as Margaret could tell, consisted mainly of posting filtered photos of smoothie bowls on Instagram and selling overpriced essential oils to her friends. But Margaret had kept that observation to herself. The guest room, Margaret's former office, had been transformed beyond recognition. Gone were the built-in shelves, where she'd kept her professional reference books and family photos. In their place were minimalist floating shelves holding Jessica's collection of crystals and aromatherapy diffusers. Margaret's desk, the one David had refinished for her 20th work anniversary, had been moved to the garage to make room for a changing station and rocker. We'll move it back when we leave, Jessica had promised, but Margaret had noticed the desk was already growing a film of dust from the garage's poor ventilation. Her daily walks had become exercises in neighbor management. Mrs. Patterson from next door had started asking pointed questions about how long Bradley and Jessica would be staying. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street had mentioned that the Homeowners Association was getting complaints about the number of cars in Margaret's driveway. It's temporary, Margaret had repeated so many times the words had lost all meaning. But the most painful erosion had been the gradual disappearance of her relationship with Emma. At first, Margaret had treasured her grandmother duties. Morning cuddles, afternoon walks to the park, reading bedtime stories in the rocking chair that had once been Bradley's. But Jessica had opinions about everything. She's too stimulated before nap time when you read to her, Jessica had declared after finding Margaret and Emma giggling over a picture book. The pediatrician says overstimulation can disrupt sleep patterns. You're giving her too many snacks. I have her on a very specific eating schedule. That soap you use is too harsh for toddler skin. I've switched her to organic, fragrance-free products only. Each criticism had chipped away at Margaret's confidence, until she found herself second-guessing every interaction with her own granddaughter. Was she holding Emma wrong? Talking too loudly? Teaching her inappropriate words when they sang old nursery rhymes together? The final straw with Emma had come on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Margaret had been teaching Emma to count using cheerfully colored blocks, something they'd done dozens of times before. Emma was giggling and stacking the blocks into wobbly towers when Jessica had swept into the room like an educational tornado. Oh no, sweetie, we don't play with those anymore, Jessica had said, scooping up the blocks with barely concealed horror. These are plastic, and they're probably full of BPA and other chemicals. Plus, they're not developmentally appropriate. Emma needs toys that challenge her spatial reasoning and fine motor skills. She'd replaced the blocks with a set of expensive wooden toys that Emma ignored in favor of crawling under the coffee table and playing peekaboo with Margaret. But even that had been wrong, according to Jessica's latest parenting blog. Physical hiding games can create anxiety about object permanence, she'd explained, as if Margaret hadn't successfully raised a child of her own. We're focusing on more structured play activities now. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Margaret had retreated to her bedroom that night and called her sister Linda in Phoenix, keeping her voice low to avoid being overheard. I feel like a stranger in my own house, Margaret had whispered into the phone, and I'm starting to feel like a stranger to Emma, too. Why don't you just ask them to leave? Linda had asked, practical as always. Because Jessica's pregnant, and they're my family, and I'm not some heartless old woman who kicks out her pregnant daughter-in-law. You're not heartless, Maggie. You're a doormat. There's a difference. Margaret had hung up feeling worse than before, because she knew Linda was right. The financial arrangements had been the next domino to fall. The promise to help with expenses had materialized into Jessica buying premium organic groceries that cost 3 times Margaret's usual budget, then leaving Margaret to pay the bills. The utility costs had skyrocketed from constant laundry loads, Jessica's need for the air conditioning to be kept at a precise 68 degrees, and her habit of leaving every light in the house on. When Margaret had gently mentioned that the electric bill had doubled, Jessica had responded with wounded surprise. I had no idea you were struggling financially, she'd said, managing to make it sound like Margaret was the irresponsible one. Maybe we should look into government assistance programs for seniors. I've heard there are some really good resources for people on fixed incomes. Margaret had been managing money for businesses and families for 35 years. She owned her home outright, had substantial savings, and earned steady income from her consulting work. She was not struggling financially, and she was not on a fixed income. But explaining this to Jessica would have required admitting that money wasn't actually the issue. The issue was respect. The issue was consideration. The issue was the growing certainty that Jessica had never intended this arrangement to be temporary. That certainty had crystallized one evening in late October, when Margaret had overheard Jessica on the phone with someone, probably her sister, speaking in the low, intimate tone people used when they thought they weren't being listened to. Oh, it's perfect, Jessica had been saying. She's got this huge house all to herself, and honestly, I think she's grateful for the company. I mean, what else does she have to do all day? And Bradley's right. It's not like she needs all this space at her age. Margaret had stood frozen in the hallway holding a basket of laundry that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The best part is, she's actually saving money by having us here. We're paying for groceries and helping with utilities. Really, we're doing her a favor. Margaret had retreated to her bedroom, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of her bed staring at the framed photo of David on her nightstand. He would have known what to do. David had always been better at confrontation, better at setting boundaries, better at saying no when no needed to be said. But David was gone, and Margaret was 74 years old, and somewhere along the way she had forgotten how to fight for herself. The next morning, Jessica had announced over breakfast that she'd found the perfect location for her expanded boutique concept. The rent was higher than expected, but the foot traffic was incredible, and she was sure it would be a success. We'll probably need to stay here a little longer than planned, she'd said, buttering her organic, gluten-free toast with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. Maybe through the spring. Is that okay, Mom? Margaret had looked at Bradley, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge that this wasn't what they'd agreed to show some sign that he remembered his mother was doing them a favor. But Bradley had been scrolling through his phone, nodding absently, already mentally moved into whatever version of the future Jessica was painting. Of course, Margaret had heard herself say, whatever you need. And that was when she'd realized that somewhere in the last 2 months, she had stopped being the owner of her own home and started being a guest in it. Somewhere along the way, temporary had become permanent, and family had become something that took from her without asking, and gave back nothing but criticism and condescension. She was 74 years old, and she had become invisible in her own life. But Margaret Chen had spent 35 years managing other people's money, cleaning up their mistakes, and finding solutions to problems they didn't even know they had. She had forensic accounting skills that could trace financial irregularities through decades of paperwork. She had professional relationships with lawyers, auditors, and investigators who owed her favors. And she had just realized that Jessica and Bradley had made a crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed that age meant weakness. They had confused kindness with stupidity. And most importantly, they had forgotten that the woman they were taking advantage of was the same woman who had spent her entire career making sure numbers added up correctly. Margaret Chen was about to teach them a lesson in advanced mathematics. The kind where their bank account would eventually equal zero, and her respect for herself would finally return to its proper value. But first, she had to finish making those scones. After all, she'd need her strength for what was coming next. November in Dallas brought crisp mornings and the kind of golden light that made Margaret remember why she'd fallen in love with this house 42 years ago. But the beauty outside her windows felt increasingly disconnected from the reality inside her walls, where every day brought new accommodations, new compromises, new ways of making herself smaller. Jessica's morning sickness had arrived with a vengeance, transforming the household routine into something that revolved entirely around her fluctuating needs. The kitchen, once Margaret's sanctuary where she'd planned meals and balanced checkbooks in peaceful solitude, had become a minefield of forbidden scents and sudden dietary restrictions. "I can't even walk past the coffee maker without feeling nauseous," Jessica had announced one Tuesday morning, hand pressed dramatically to her forehead. "The smell is just overwhelming. I read that pregnant women have heightened olfactory sensitivity, and caffeine aromas can trigger severe reactions." Margaret had been drinking coffee in that kitchen for 4 decades. The Mr. Coffee machine on the counter had been a wedding gift from David's parents, still working perfectly after all these years. But now it sat unplugged and pushed into a corner, replaced by Jessica's elaborate herbal tea setup that took up half the counter space. "Maybe you could make your coffee in the garage?" Jessica had suggested with that bright, helpful tone that wasn't really a suggestion at all. "Just until I get through the first trimester? I know it's an inconvenience, but the baby has to come first." The baby. Everything had become about the baby. Not Jessica's baby, not Bradley and Jessica's baby, but the baby. As if this unborn child had somehow claimed dominion over every decision in Margaret's house. Margaret had accommodated, of course. She'd moved her coffee routine to the garage, standing between her dusty desk and boxes of Christmas decorations, while she sipped her morning cup and tried to convince herself this was temporary. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent in Jessica's world. The herbal tea setup had expanded to include a mini refrigerator for her special organic milk alternatives, a collection of supplements that required precise timing, and a meditation corner complete with crystals and a small altar that made Margaret's Methodist sensibilities itch. "It's important for the baby's development that I maintain my spiritual practices," Jessica had explained when Margaret had found her burning sage in the living room at 6 in the morning. "Prenatal stress can cause developmental delays, and my meditation practice is the only thing keeping me centered right now." Margaret had nodded and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door against the smell of burning herbs and the sound of Jessica's chanted affirmations. She'd pulled out her phone and Googled tenant rights Texas before catching herself and closing the browser. They weren't tenants. They were family. The family didn't evict the family over sage burning and herbal tea. The library visits had become her escape. 3 times a week, Margaret would drive to the downtown branch and settle into her favorite chair in the periodicals section, reading financial journals and catching up on tax law changes. It was the only place she could think clearly. The only place where she remembered who she used to be before she became the woman who accommodated everyone else's needs. It was during one of these library sessions that she'd met Dorothy Huang, a retired family law attorney who'd been coming to the same reading room for 15 years. They'd struck up a conversation over an article about elder financial abuse, and Dorothy had shared stories from her practice that made Margaret's situation seem almost mundane by comparison. The thing about family financial abuse, Dorothy had said over coffee in the library cafe, is that it's almost never dramatic. It's not someone forging checks or stealing jewelry. It's the slow erosion of boundaries, the gradual shift from helping out to complete dependency. Margaret had stirred her latte slowly, thinking about Jessica's expanding list of needs and Bradley's apparent blindness to his mother's sacrifice. "How do you know when it crosses the line?" Margaret had asked. Dorothy had given her a sharp look. "When you're asking that question, you've usually already crossed it." That conversation had planted a seed, but Margaret had pushed it aside. She was not being financially abused. She was helping her family through a difficult time. There was a difference, even if she was having trouble articulating what that difference was. Back home, the accommodations continued to multiply. Jessica's boutique research had taken over the dining room table, spreading across the mahogany surface like a paper virus. Business plans, fabric samples, vendor catalogs, and color-coded spreadsheets covered every inch, making it impossible for Margaret to use the table for meals or bill paying. "I'm so sorry about the mess," Jessica had said, not moving to clean any of it up, "but I'm at such a critical stage in the planning process. This boutique is going to change everything for our family. I just need to get all the details perfect." Margaret had started eating her meals, standing at the kitchen counter, balancing her plate, while Jessica's empire of papers claimed the dining room indefinitely. When she'd mentioned that she needed the table for her monthly client meeting with the Rodriguez family's small restaurant books, Jessica had suggested she meet them at their business instead. "It might actually be more professional," Jessica had said. "I mean, having business meetings in someone's home can seem a little informal, especially now that we have a toddler running around." Margaret had been conducting business meetings in her dining room for 23 years. Her clients appreciated the personal touch, the coffee and homemade cookies, the comfortable environment where they could spread out their paperwork without feeling rushed. But Jessica's opinion had somehow become more important than 2 decades of successful client relationships. The Rodriguez meeting had indeed taken place at their restaurant, crammed into a booth during their slow afternoon hours, while the smell of fryer oil mixed with Margaret's usual methodical review of their quarterly reports. Mr. Rodriguez had asked twice if everything was all right at home, his weathered face creased with concern. "Of course," Margaret had replied, the lie sitting heavy in her throat. "Just some temporary family adjustments." Emma's second birthday had been the event that fully illuminated how completely Margaret's role in her own home had shifted. She'd been planning the party for weeks, reaching out to Bradley's old friends who had children, researching age-appropriate activities, and designing invitations with Emma's favorite cartoon character. Jessica had reviewed the guest list like a military general planning a strategic operation. "I think we need to be more selective," she'd said, red pen hovering over names Margaret had carefully compiled. "Some of these people I've never even met, and honestly, big parties can be overstimulating for toddlers. The child development experts all recommend smaller, more intimate celebrations." The guest list had been cut from 23 to 8. Margaret's neighbor friends had been eliminated entirely, deemed not really Emma's people by Jessica. The elaborate menu Margaret had planned was replaced with Jessica's vision of allergen-free options that turned a birthday party into what looked more like a health food convention. "I've hired a photographer," Jessica had announced the week before the party, "someone who specializes in lifestyle photography. This is going to be Emma's first birthday that she might actually remember, so we want everything to be perfect." The photographer had arrived early, a young woman with an expensive camera and an apparent inability to acknowledge Margaret's existence. She rearranged furniture, moved decorations, and directed the party like a film shoot, with Jessica as the star and Emma as a willing prop. Margaret had found herself relegated to kitchen duty, washing dishes and replenishing snacks, while Jessica posed with Emma for what seemed like hundreds of photos. When Margaret had attempted to join a few shots, after all, she was Emma's grandmother, the photographer had politely but firmly suggested she step back a bit to avoid casting shadows. The final insult had come when Jessica posted the photos on social media that evening. Margaret scrolled through dozens of images of Jessica and Emma, Bradley and Emma, and family friends with Emma. She appeared in exactly 3 photos, And in all of them, she was partially obscured by other people or captured in the background carrying plates or cleaning up. The caption had read, "Emma's perfect second birthday celebration. So grateful for all the love and support as we build our beautiful family traditions. Hashtag blessed mama, hashtag years of joy, hashtag family first." Margaret had stared at her phone screen for 20 minutes, trying to find herself in Jessica's version of their family story. She was the ghost in her own home, invisible even in photographs taken in her own living room. Sleep had become elusive. Margaret found herself lying awake at night, listening to the sounds of Jessica and Bradley's conversations through the thin walls. Jessica's voice carried easily, animated and confident, as she made plans that seemed to assume permanent residence. The master bedroom upstairs would make a perfect nursery suite, Margaret had heard Jessica say one night in early December. We could put the crib in the alcove and use the rest of the space for a play area. Emma's getting too big for the pack and play anyway. But that's Mom's room, Bradley had replied, his voice lower but still audible. Well, she's not using all that space. And honestly, it would be better for her to be on the main floor anyway. Stairs can be dangerous for older people. We'd actually be doing her a favor. Margaret had pressed her face into her pillow, fighting the urge to march down the hall and reclaim her position as the adult in charge of her own house. But confrontation required energy she no longer seemed to possess, and the certainty that she would be painted as the unreasonable one who was putting her own comfort ahead of a growing family's needs. The financial strain had become more apparent as Christmas approached. Jessica's boutique planning had evolved into actual spending, sample inventory, website development, marketing materials, and professional consultations that appeared on credit card statements Bradley had started leaving on Margaret's kitchen counter. "I hate to ask," Bradley had said during one of their increasingly rare private conversations, "but we're a little tight this month. The boutique startup costs are higher than we expected, and with Emma's daycare expenses." Emma wasn't in daycare. Jessica had declared institutional childcare, quote, "toxic to developing immune systems," and kept Emma home full-time, which meant Margaret had become the de facto babysitter whenever Jessica needed to run errands or attend business meetings. "How much do you need?" Margaret had asked the question automatically after months of similar requests. "Just enough to cover the minimum payments this month. Maybe $1,500? We'll pay you back as soon as the boutique gets off the ground." $1,500 had become $3,000 by the time all the bills were covered. The credit card statements revealed charges Margaret hadn't heard about. Maternity clothes from expensive boutiques, prenatal massage sessions, organic meal delivery services that cost more per week than Margaret spent on groceries per month. "Jessica needs to take care of herself during the pregnancy," Bradley had explained when Margaret had questioned some of the charges. "Stress isn't good for the baby, and if these things help her feel better, then they're medical necessities." Margaret had written the check, but she'd also started keeping copies of everything, not because she planned to do anything with the information, but because her accountant's instincts demanded documentation. Numbers told stories, and the story these numbers were telling was one of escalating dependency with no end in sight. The holiday decorating had been the final accommodation that made Margaret realize how completely she'd been erased from her own life. She'd been decorating this house for Christmas for 42 years, each ornament carrying memories of Christmases past, each tradition carefully maintained through decades of celebration. Jessica Aveva surveyed Margaret's decoration boxes like an interior designer, evaluating a particularly challenging renovation project. "These are so vintage," she'd said, holding up a delicate glass angel that had been Margaret's mother's. "I was thinking we could go with a more modern, minimalist approach this year. You know, something more sophisticated. I found this amazing white and gold theme on Pinterest that would look incredible with our current aesthetic." Margaret's red and green felt stockings, embroidered with family names in her own careful stitching, had been replaced with sleek cream-colored ones from an upscale home goods store. The handmade ornaments Bradley had created in elementary school had been deemed too cluttered for Jessica's vision of sophisticated holiday decor. The tree itself had become a monument to Jessica's taste rather than a celebration of family history. White lights instead of the colorful ones Margaret had always loved. Coordinated ball ornaments in precise color gradients instead of the eclectic collection of meaningful decorations accumulated over decades. Margaret had found her old ornaments carefully packed away in the basement, like artifacts from a previous civilization. She'd sat on the concrete floor, holding the little wooden reindeer David had carved during their third Christmas together, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not because of the ornaments, although they mattered, not even because of the accumulated slights and accommodations, although they had worn her down to something she barely recognized. She cried because she realized that she had become complicit in her own erasure. Every time she'd said, "of course," when she meant absolutely not. Every time she'd moved her own belongings to make room for Jessica's preferences. Every time she'd swallowed her objections to keep the peace. Every time she'd chosen accommodation over assertion, she'd handed over another piece of herself, until there was barely anything left. She was 74 years old, and she'd forgotten how to say no. She'd forgotten that her comfort mattered, that her preferences had value, that her home was supposed to be her sanctuary rather than her prison. But Margaret Chen hadn't spent 35 years in accounting without learning that every transaction had to balance. For months she'd been giving and giving and giving, while Jessica and Bradley had been taking and taking and taking. It was time to audit the books. And when Margaret Chen audited books, she always found the discrepancies. The question was no longer whether she was being taken advantage of. The question was what she was going to do about it, and how much it was going to cost them when she finally added up the bill. The new year arrived with ice storms and Jessica's renewed determination to transform Margaret's house into what she called a proper family home. January in Dallas meant unpredictable weather, and Margaret had always loved the drama of it. The way ice turned ordinary trees into crystal sculptures, the way the whole city slowed down and remembered that nature still held the ultimate authority. But this January felt different. Everything felt different when you were a stranger in your own life. Margaret's morning routine had been compressed into a 15-minute window between Jessica's pre-breakfast meditation and Emma's elaborate organic breakfast preparation. She'd taken to setting her alarm for 5:30, creeping downstairs in her robe and slippers to steal a few precious moments of solitude before the house filled with Jessica's particular brand of orchestrated chaos. It was during one of these quiet mornings that she'd discovered the real estate apps on Jessica's phone. The phone had been left charging on the kitchen counter, screen glowing with notifications. Margaret hadn't meant to look. She wasn't the type of person who snooped through other people's devices. But a text message preview had caught her eye. Found 3 more properties in your price range. The Victorian on Elm Street has amazing potential for renovation. Margaret's hands had trembled as she'd stared at the screen. Victorian on Elm Street. That was her address. Her house was the Victorian on Elm Street. She'd stood there in her robe, coffee mug halfway to her lips, trying to process what she was seeing. More messages had appeared. Can you tour this afternoon? And the seller might be motivated if she's moving to senior living. And perfect bones for an open concept redesign. The coffee had gone cold in her hands as the truth settled into her bones like winter chill. Jessica wasn't planning to leave Margaret's house. She was planning to buy it. Margaret had set the phone down exactly where she'd found it and retreated to her bedroom, where she'd sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the framed photograph of David until her breathing returned to normal. Then she opened her laptop and done something she should have done months ago. She'd researched Jessica's boutique. What she'd found was a digital ghost story. The Instagram account Jessica referenced constantly had exactly 47 followers, most of them apparent bots. The business registration she'd claimed to have filed didn't exist in the Texas Secretary of State database. The partnerships with local influencers were fictional. The pending investors were imaginary, and the elaborate business plan spread across Margaret's dining room table was built on a foundation of complete fantasy. Jessica Taylor, Margaret had learned her maiden name from a quick search, had never owned a business. Her previous employment history consisted of 3 retail jobs, each lasting less than 8 months, and a brief stint selling insurance that had ended when her employer discovered discrepancies in her client files. But Jessica did have a history, an eviction notice from her previous apartment, small claims, court judgments from unpaid debts, a pattern of financial instability that stretched back years, always resolved by moving on to the next situation, the next relationship, the next opportunity to start fresh. Margaret had closed the laptop feeling nauseated, but not from morning sickness. From the sick realization that she'd been played by a professional. Someone who'd made a career out of finding comfortable situations and manipulating her way into them. The confrontation had come 2 days later, during what Margaret had intended to be a casual conversation about timeline expectations. She'd waited until Emma was napping and Bradley was at work, approaching Jessica in the living room where she was surrounded by fabric samples and vendor catalogs that would never become an actual business. "I was wondering if you'd given any more thought to your moving timeline," Margaret had said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I know you'd mentioned spring originally, and I'm starting to think about some home maintenance projects I've been putting off." Jessica had looked up with that bright, patient smile that had become as familiar as it was infuriating. "Oh, about that," Jessica had said, setting down a swatch of fabric that probably cost more per yard than Margaret spent on groceries per week. "We've actually been talking and we think it might make more sense for us to stay longer term, maybe even permanently." Quote, the words had hung in the air like smoke from a fire Margaret couldn't yet see. "Permanently? Well, think about it logically," Jessica had continued, her voice taking on that reasonable, educational tone she used when explaining things to people she considered less informed. "You're 74 years old, living alone in this huge house. It can't be easy to maintain, and honestly, it's not really safe. What if you fell down those stairs? What if you had a medical emergency and nobody was here to help?" Margaret had felt her chest tighten, but Jessica had been just getting started. "And from a financial perspective, it makes perfect sense. You're probably spending a fortune heating and cooling all this space you don't use. Having us here helps with expenses, gives you companionship, and provides built-in help with Emma. Really, it's ideal for everyone." "But this is my house," Margaret had said, the words feeling strange in her mouth, as if she was stating something that had become unclear. Jessica's expression had shifted slightly, the bright smile flickering like a candle in wind. "Of course it's your house, legally, but let's be realistic about what's best for everyone involved. You're not getting any younger, and this place is way too much for one person to handle. Bradley and I have been talking to a financial planner about the best way to structure things going forward." "What kind of structure?" "Well, you could retain ownership, obviously, but maybe transfer the deed into a family trust. That way, when something happens to you, and I don't mean to be morbid, but we have to think ahead, the property stays in the family instead of going through probate. It's actually a very smart estate planning strategy." Margaret had stared at Jessica, finally seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the helpful daughter-in-law, not the struggling young mother, but the predator who'd been circling for months, waiting for the right moment to move in for the kill. "I haven't agreed to any of this," Margaret had said. "Of course not. It's just something to think about. I mean, realistically, what are your other options? Sell the house and move into some depressing senior community? Live here alone until you can't take care of yourself anymore and have to go into a nursing home anyway?" Jessica had leaned forward, her voice dropping into what she probably thought was a caring, confidential tone. "This way, you get to age in place, maintain your independence, and still have family around. Plus, Emma gets to grow up in this beautiful house, and the new baby will have space to play. It's really the perfect solution." Margaret had excused herself and walked upstairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body. In her bedroom, she'd closed the door and called Dorothy Huang. "She's trying to steal your house," Dorothy had said after listening to Margaret's summary of the conversation. "It's a classic eldercare scam, but she's doing it from the inside. Much harder to prosecute, much easier to accomplish." "But Bradley wouldn't." "Bradley doesn't have to be actively complicit," Dorothy had interrupted. "He just has to be passive enough to let it happen. And from what you've told me, passivity is his specialty." That night, Margaret had lain awake, listening to Jessica and Bradley's voices through the wall, their conversation taking on a different quality now that she understood what she was really hearing. "She seemed a little resistant to the idea," Jessica had been saying, "but I think she'll come around once she realizes how much sense it makes. I mean, what else is she gonna do? She can't live here alone forever." "Maybe we should give her more time to think about it," Bradley had replied, and Margaret had felt a flicker of hope that her son might still have some loyalty left for his mother. "Time for what? To dig in her heels and make this harder than it needs to be? Bradley, your mother is 74 years old. She's already showing signs of confusion and poor judgment, letting us move in rent-free, not keeping track of expenses, forgetting conversations we've had. Margaret had pressed her ear closer to the wall, her heart pounding with indignation. She wasn't confused. She wasn't forgetful. She was being deliberately misled and manipulated, and Jessica was already building a case for her mental incompetence. "I just think we should be gentle about it," Bradley had said. "She's been through a lot since Dad died." "Of course we'll be gentle. But we also have to be realistic. She needs help, whether she wants to admit it or not. And we're the logical people to provide that help. Really, we're doing her a favor." Margaret had rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling, and feeling something cold and sharp crystallizing in her chest. Not hurt. She was beyond hurt now. Not even anger, though that would come later. What she felt was clarity, pure, undiluted understanding of exactly what was happening and exactly what she was going to do about it. But the final blow had come 3 weeks later, during what should have been a celebration. Margaret's 75th birthday had arrived on a Tuesday in late January, marked by the kind of brittle cold that made Dallas feel like a different city entirely. She'd been hoping for a quiet celebration, maybe dinner at her favorite restaurant with Bradley, or a small gathering with her sister Linda, who was visiting from Phoenix. Instead, Jessica had planned a surprise party. "I invited everyone," Jessica had announced that morning, her voice bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished something remarkable. "Your neighbors, some of Bradley's coworkers, even that nice librarian you're always talking about. It's gonna be perfect." Margaret had felt her stomach drop. She'd specifically asked for something low-key, something that wouldn't disrupt Emma's routine or require elaborate preparations. But Jessica had apparently interpreted this as an opportunity to showcase her event planning skills and her position as the woman who now made decisions in Margaret's house. The guests had arrived at 6, filling Margaret's living room with people she barely knew and conversations she couldn't quite follow. Jessica had hired the same photographer from Emma's birthday party, turning Margaret's birthday into another lifestyle shoot, with Jessica as the hostess and Margaret as a prop in her own celebration. But the real humiliation had come when it was time to cut the cake. Margaret had been sitting at the head of her own dining table, surrounded by people who kept glancing at Jessica for cues about when to sit, when to eat, when to sing. The cake itself was beautiful, a towering creation from an expensive bakery, decorated with flowers that probably cost more than Margaret usually spent on groceries for a week. Jessica had positioned herself behind Margaret's chair, hands resting on Margaret's shoulders like a daughter presenting her beloved mother. The photographer had snapped several shots, capturing what would undoubtedly become social media evidence of Jessica's devotion and care. "Before we cut the cake," Jessica had announced, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I just want to say how grateful we all are for Margaret. She's been so generous, opening her home to our growing family, and we couldn't ask for a more wonderful mother and grandmother." Murmurs of agreement had rippled through the room. Margaret had smiled and nodded, playing her assigned role while something died quietly inside her chest. "And," Jessica had continued, her hands squeezing Margaret's shoulders with what probably looked like affection, "we're so excited that she's agreed to let us make this arrangement permanent. It just makes so much sense for everyone involved." Margaret had gone completely still. Around the table, neighbors and acquaintances had smiled and nodded, assuming this was welcome news. Mrs. Patterson from next door had even clapped softly, as if permanent occupancy by a young family was exactly what every 75-year-old woman dreamed of for her birthday. "We haven't actually," Margaret had started to say, but Jessica had cut her off with a laugh. "Oh, she's being modest. We've been talking about it for weeks. Haven't we, Mom?" The word mom had felt like a slap. Jessica had never called her mom before, had always used her first name with the kind of careful distance that acknowledged boundaries. But now, in front of an audience, Margaret had suddenly become mom, and the decision about her own house had become a foregone conclusion. Margaret had looked around the table at faces that were politely interested but not particularly invested. These people would go home and tell their own families about the nice birthday party where the sweet old lady had agreed to let her son's family move in permanently. They would frame it as a heartwarming story about family taking care of family, never suspecting they'd witnessed a public manipulation. She'd looked at Bradley sitting across from her with Emma on his lap and seen nothing in his expression but mild contentment. No surprise at Jessica's announcement. No concern about his mother's obvious discomfort. Just the blank satisfaction of someone whose problems were being solved by other people. That was when Jessica had leaned down, her mouth close to Margaret's ear, ostensibly to whisper something loving and private for the photographer to capture. Instead, her voice had been barely audible, meant only for Margaret's ears. "Don't hug the baby too much tonight," Jessica had whispered, her breath warm against Margaret's cheek. "You smell like death, and I don't want her getting used to it." The words had hit Margaret like ice water. Around the table, guests had continued chatting and laughing, completely unaware that she'd just been delivered a message that crystallized everything she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Jessica didn't see her as family. Jessica didn't even see her as human. She saw her as an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, an old woman whose only value was in what she owned, and how quickly she could be convinced to give it up. Margaret had sat perfectly still while the photographer captured what must have looked like a tender moment between two generations of women. She'd smiled when Jessica straightened up and began cutting the cake. She'd accepted congratulations from guests who thought they were celebrating a wonderful family arrangement. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd spent months accommodating and compromising and swallowing her objections had finally reached her limit. The accountant, who'd spent 35 years balancing books and finding discrepancies, had finally identified the largest theft of her career. They wanted to steal her house, her independence, and her dignity. They'd been working toward that goal for months, using her own kindness and family loyalty as weapons against her. Margaret Chen had built her reputation on making numbers add up correctly, and the numbers in this situation were about to get very, very interesting. But first, she had to finish playing the role of the grateful birthday girl. After all, she'd need Jessica and Bradley to believe they'd won until the moment she proved exactly how wrong they were. The cake tasted like cardboard, but Margaret ate every bite with a smile. She thanked Jessica for the wonderful party, hugged her guests goodbye, and accepted their well wishes about her new living arrangement with grace and apparent gratitude. And when the last guest had left and the dishes were cleared, Margaret excused herself to her bedroom and began making phone calls that would change everything. Starting with Dorothy Huang, who answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting for this exact call. "It's time," Margaret had said, and Dorothy had responded with two words that sounded like the beginning of justice. "Let's begin." Dorothy Huang's law office occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Dallas, the kind of space that whispered competence and discretion. Margaret had arrived 15 minutes early, sitting in the reception area with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse, and a resolve that felt as solid as the building's brick foundation. "You've been busy," Dorothy had said after reviewing Margaret's documentation. Tax returns, bank statements, credit card bills, Bradley's employment records, Jessica's fabricated business plan, screenshots of the real estate conversations, and a detailed timeline of every financial request and accommodation over the past 5 months. "I spent 35 years cleaning up other people's financial messes," Margaret had replied. "I know how to build a case." Dorothy had smiled with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated thorough preparation. "This isn't just thorough, this is surgical. What exactly do you want to accomplish?" Margaret had leaned forward, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who'd made peace with what she was about to unleash. "I want them gone. Permanently. And I want to make sure they never try this with anyone else." Revenge or justice? Is there a difference? Dorothy had laughed, the sound sharp and approving. "In this case, probably not. Let's talk about strategy." The first step had been establishing Margaret's mental competence beyond any possible challenge. Jessica's whispered comments about confusion and poor judgment hadn't been random cruelty. They'd been groundwork for a potential incompetence claim if Margaret ever tried to reclaim control of her own life. "We need to document your cognitive fitness," Dorothy had explained. "Independent medical evaluation, psychological assessment, financial competency examination. We want a paper trail that proves you're sharper than most people half your age." Dr. Sarah Kim's medical practice specialized in geriatric assessments, and Margaret had spent 3 hours undergoing tests that would have challenged a graduate student. Memory recall, problem solving, mathematical reasoning, and comprehensive psychological evaluation designed to identify any signs of diminished capacity. "Your results are remarkable," Dr. Kim had said during the follow-up appointment. "Not just for your age group, but across all demographics. Your cognitive function is in the top 5% of test takers." The written report had been even more definitive. "Patient demonstrates exceptional mental acuity, superior financial reasoning skills, and complete independence in all areas of decision-making. No evidence of cognitive impairment, depression, or diminished capacity." Armed with medical proof of her competence, Margaret had begun the more delicate work of gathering evidence without arousing suspicion. The key was maintaining her role as the accommodating mother and grandmother, while methodically documenting every aspect of Jessica and Bradley's financial parasitism. Margaret's background in forensic accounting proved invaluable. She'd spent decades tracking money through complex business structures, identifying patterns of fraud, and building cases that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Compared to corporate embezzlement schemes, Jessica's manipulations were almost embarrassingly transparent. The credit card statements told a story of escalating entitlement. What had started as emergency expenses had evolved into a lifestyle funded entirely by Margaret's accounts. Jessica's maternity wardrobe from designer boutiques. Weekly massage appointments justified as prenatal care. Organic meal delivery services that cost more than most families spent on groceries. Premium childcare products for Emma, despite Jessica's insistence that she couldn't afford daycare. But the most damning evidence had come from Jessica's own digital footprint. Social media posts that contradicted her claims of financial hardship. Photos of expensive dinners out while Margaret ate sandwiches standing at her kitchen counter. Shopping hauls tagged with boutiques that charged more for a single outfit than Margaret spent on clothing in a year. Margaret had screenshots everything, organized it by date and category, and created a financial timeline that would have impressed her most meticulous auditing clients. Total documented expenses charged to Margaret's accounts, $47,000 over 5 months. Total contributions from Bradley and Jessica toward household expenses, $0. Meanwhile, she'd maintained her facade of grateful accommodation. She'd continued making Jessica's herbal tea each morning, continued eating her meals standing up while the dining room remained buried under fake business plans, and continued retreating to her bedroom while Jessica held court in the living room she'd redesigned. The acting had been exhausting, but it was crucial that Jessica and Bradley believed their plan was working. Margaret needed them to be comfortable and careless, continuing to generate evidence while she built her counterattack. The private investigator Dorothy had recommended was a former police detective named Marcus Torres, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Margaret had met him at a coffee shop near his office, sliding a folder across the table with the efficiency of someone conducting a business transaction. "I need you to verify someone's employment history and current financial status," Margaret had said. "Everything legal, everything documented, everything admissible in court if necessary." Marcus had been thorough. Jessica's employment record was even worse than Margaret's initial research had revealed. Not just short-term positions and unexplained gaps, but a pattern of workplace conflicts that suggested personality disorders or ethical problems. 2 previous employers had noted inappropriate financial requests from customers. One had terminated her for quote, boundary violations with clients. Bradley's situation was more complex. His job was legitimate, his employment stable, but his financial management was catastrophic. Credit card debt in excess of $80,000. Student loans in default. A car loan 3 months behind. 2 previous apartment evictions for non-payment of rent. "Your son isn't malicious," Marcus had reported during their second meeting. "He's just weak, classic enabler personality. He probably genuinely believes they're helping you, as much as you're helping them." Margaret had studied the investigator's report with the clinical detachment of someone reviewing audit findings. Bradley's weakness didn't excuse his complicity, but it did explain his willingness to let Jessica orchestrate their financial parasitism while he maintained plausible deniability. The real estate component of Jessica's plan had been the most sophisticated part of her scheme. Margaret's research revealed that Jessica had been consulting with a mortgage broker about financing options for family property transfers. She'd researched estate planning attorneys who specialized in, quote, helping seniors transition housing responsibilities to younger family members. Most disturbingly, she'd made inquiries about Margaret's property taxes, homeowners insurance, and maintenance costs, information she could only have obtained by going through Margaret's personal papers. She's been planning this for months, Dorothy had concluded after reviewing the real estate evidence, possibly since before they moved in. This isn't opportunistic parasitism. This is premeditated fraud. Quote, the legal strategy Dorothy had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to prove Jessica's intent to defraud, which could be difficult to establish definitively, they would focus on the documented financial abuse that had already occurred. We have 5 months of clear evidence that they've used your accounts for personal expenses without your explicit consent, Dorothy had explained. We have evidence of deception about their financial status and business plans. We have evidence of manipulation and emotional abuse designed to undermine your decision-making capacity. The civil lawsuit would be straightforward: restitution for documented expenses, compensation for emotional distress, and a restraining order preventing future contact or attempts to access Margaret's property. But Dorothy had also suggested a parallel approach that appealed to Margaret's sense of justice. We report Jessica to the district attorney's office for elder financial abuse. It's a felony in Texas, especially when the amounts reach this level. Even if they choose not to prosecute, having an official investigation on record will prevent her from trying this scheme with other victims. Margaret had authorized both approaches. Civil court would recover her money and remove them from her home. Criminal referral would protect future victims and create a permanent record of Jessica's predatory behavior. The timing of their legal offensive had been carefully calculated. Dorothy wanted to file all documents simultaneously, preventing Jessica and Bradley from having time to destroy evidence or mount a coordinated defense. We served them on a Tuesday morning, Dorothy had explained. Civil complaint, restraining order, and criminal complaint all delivered at the same time. Maximum shock value, minimum recovery time. But Margaret had requested one additional element that wasn't strictly legal but was absolutely necessary for her own peace of mind. She wanted to confront them first. Not in court, not through lawyers, but face-to-face in her own living room, with the evidence spread across the coffee table and her son forced to see exactly what his wife had been doing in his name. It's risky, Dorothy had warned. They might try to destroy evidence or claim you threatened them. Let them try, Margaret had replied. I've been playing defense for 5 months. It's time they learned what offense looks like. Quote, the confrontation was scheduled for Sunday evening, after Emma's bedtime, in the living room where Jessica had redesigned around her own preferences. Margaret would present the evidence methodically, like the financial analyst she'd been for 3 decades. No emotion, no accusations, just numbers and documents, and the undeniable reality of what they'd done. Dorothy would be on standby, ready to file emergency protective orders if the confrontation turned ugly. Marcus Torres would be conducting surveillance from his car outside, documenting any attempts at intimidation or retaliation. Margaret had spent Saturday evening reviewing her presentation materials one final time. Bank statements organized by month. Credit card bills highlighted to show Jessica's charges. Screenshots of social media posts that contradicted claims of financial hardship. The fake business plan, with its fictional revenue projections and imaginary investor meetings. She'd also prepared something that wasn't admissible in court, but was essential for her own closure. A detailed accounting of every accommodation she'd made, every boundary she'd allowed to be crossed, every time she'd swallowed her objections to keep the peace. The list was 7 pages long, single-spaced, and it told the story of a woman who'd been systematically erased from her own life by people who'd claimed to love her. But tomorrow night, the erasure will end. Tomorrow night, Margaret Chen would remind Jessica and Bradley exactly who owned this house, who controlled the finances, and who had the power to determine their future. She'd spent 75 years learning to be kind, accommodating, and generous with people she cared about. Now she was about to spend one evening teaching them the difference between kindness and weakness. The lesson was going to be expensive, for them. Margaret had gone to bed Saturday night with her presentation materials organized on her nightstand, and Dorothy's phone number programmed into her speed dial. Outside her window, Dallas slept under a blanket of stars that reminded her of all the nights she'd lain awake, worrying about other people's problems, while neglecting her own. Tomorrow, that will change. Tomorrow, the books will finally balance. And Jessica Taylor was about to learn that when you steal from an accountant, you'd better be prepared for a very thorough audit. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made Dallas feel like it was holding its breath. Margaret had spent the day maintaining her routine with surgical precision. Church in the morning, grocery shopping in the afternoon, dinner preparation that filled the house with the familiar sense of pot roast and vegetables. To any observer, it was a perfectly ordinary Sunday in the Chen household. But in her bedroom, Margaret's presentation materials were arranged with the methodical care of someone preparing for the most important business meeting of her life. Bank statements in chronological order. Credit card bills with Jessica's charges highlighted in yellow. Screenshots of social media posts organized by date. The fraudulent business plan, with its fictional projections and imaginary investor meetings. At exactly 7:30, after Emma had been bathed and put to bed, Margaret had walked downstairs with her materials in a leather portfolio and her resolve as solid as the house's foundation. Jessica had been lounging on the sectional sofa she'd chosen, feet propped up on the ottoman, scrolling through her phone with the casual contentment of someone who believed she'd successfully manipulated her way into permanent comfort. Bradley sat beside her, laptop open, probably reviewing work emails or playing games. Anything that allowed him to avoid engaging with the real world around him. "I'd like to have a family meeting," Margaret had said, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd used in countless client consultations over the years. Jessica had looked up with mild annoyance, the expression of someone being interrupted during leisure time. "Can it wait? I'm researching some new marketing strategies for the boutique launch." "No," Margaret had replied, settling into the armchair that had once been her regular seat before Jessica had rearranged the furniture. "It can't wait." Something in her tone had penetrated Bradley's distraction. He'd closed his laptop and given his mother the kind of cautious attention usually reserved for potential bad news. Margaret had opened her portfolio and removed the first document, a summary sheet she'd prepared that morning, typed in the same professional format she'd used for client presentations. "I've conducted a comprehensive financial analysis of our household arrangements over the past 5 months," she'd begun, her voice steady and businesslike. "I thought you might be interested in reviewing the results." Jessica had set down her phone, but her expression remained more puzzled than concerned. "What kind of analysis?" Margaret had slid the summary sheet across the coffee table, watching Jessica's face as she read the opening paragraph. Total documented expenses charged to Margaret Chen's accounts by Jessica and Bradley Taylor, $47,247.83. Total contributions to household expenses by Jessica and Bradley Taylor, $0. Net financial impact, $47,247.83. The color had drained from Jessica's face, like water from a broken sink. Bradley had leaned forward, reading over his wife's shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching horror. "Mom, what is this?" Bradley had asked, his voice carrying the uncertain tone of someone who was beginning to understand that the ground beneath him was less stable than he'd assumed. "It's an audit," Margaret had replied, removing the next set of documents from her portfolio, credit card statements, to be specific. Jessica's charges are highlighted in yellow. She'd spread the statements across the coffee table like a dealer arranging cards, each page telling part of a story that Jessica had assumed would never be compiled into a coherent narrative. December 15th, Nordstrom, $437. Maternity wear, according to the receipt. December 18th, Element Spa, $215. Prenatal massage, you said. December 22nd, Whole Foods delivery, $348 for 1 week's groceries. Margaret had continued reading charges while Jessica sat frozen, probably calculating how much evidence existed and whether there was any way to explain it away. January 3rd, Baby Einstein Learning Center, $612. January 8th, Restoration Hardware, $1,243. January 15th, another spa appointment, this time $260. Bradley had been staring at the statements like they were written in a foreign language. Jessica, some of these charges, we talked about budgeting. We agreed to be careful about expenses. They're necessities, Jessica had said, but her voice lacked its usual confident authority. Pregnancy expenses, things for Emma, household needs. Margaret had smiled with the patient satisfaction of someone who'd anticipated every possible objection. Household needs, she'd repeated, removing another document from her portfolio. Let's discuss household contributions, shall we? Quote, the next spreadsheet had detailed every grocery bill, utility payment, and maintenance expense for the past 5 months. Margaret's contributions were listed in blue ink. Jessica and Bradley's contributions were listed in red ink, but the red columns were completely empty. You promised to help with groceries, Margaret had said, her voice still maintaining its professional neutrality. The average weekly food cost since you moved in has been $432. Your average weekly contribution has been $0. We've been struggling financially, Bradley had protested. We told you that from the beginning. Yes, you did, Margaret had agreed, removing her next set of evidence, which makes these particularly interesting. The social media screenshots had been devastating. Jessica's Instagram posts from expensive restaurants, tagged with captions about treating ourselves and living our best life. Shopping hauls from boutiques that charged more for a single dress than Margaret spent on clothing in 6 months. A weekend trip to Austin that Jessica had somehow afforded despite claiming poverty. I don't understand, Bradley had said, looking between the screenshots and his wife like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Jessica, where did the money for these things come from? Jessica's composure had finally cracked. Those posts are old, she'd said, but her voice was shaking. From before, we had financial problems. Margaret had pointed to the date stamps on the screenshots. This restaurant post is from 3 weeks ago. The shopping haul is from last Tuesday. The Austin trip posts are from 2 weekends ago. The silence that followed had been thick enough to cut with a knife. Bradley had stared at his wife with the dawning realization that he'd been lied to as systematically as his mother had been stolen from. But Margaret hadn't been finished. The business plan Jessica had spread across the dining room table for months was her next target, and she'd approached it with the methodical thoroughness of someone dismantling a house of cards. Let's discuss your boutique, Margaret had said, removing a folder thick with documentation. I was curious about your business projections, so I did some research. She'd spread out copies of Jessica's business registration paperwork, or rather, the complete absence of any business registration paperwork. Tax ID applications that had never been filed. Business license applications that didn't exist. Partnership agreements with investors who turned out to be fictional. According to the Texas Secretary of State, no business entity has been registered under your name in the past 2 years, Margaret had continued. According to the IRS, you haven't filed for a federal tax ID number. According to the City of Dallas, you don't have a business license or permit for retail operations. Jessica had opened her mouth to respond, but nothing had come out. For the first time since Margaret had known her, Jessica Taylor was completely speechless. The investors you've mentioned, Margaret had continued, I tried to research them. Marcus Hendricks doesn't exist. Sarah Chen, no relation to me by the way, doesn't exist. The lifestyle brand collective you claimed wanted to partner with you is a fictional entity. Bradley had been staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. Jessica, is this true? Have you been lying about the business? It's complicated, Jessica had finally managed, but her voice was barely above a whisper. I was working on getting everything set up. These things take time. Margaret had removed her final set of documents, the investigator's report on Jessica's employment history and financial background. Your previous employment record is interesting reading, Margaret had said, her voice still maintaining that clinical, professional tone that was somehow more devastating than any amount of shouting would have been. She'd read selected highlights from Marcus Torres's investigation, the retail job Jessica had lost for inappropriate financial requests from customers, the insurance sales position she'd been terminated from for ethical violations, the pattern of short-term employment followed by unexplained gaps. And your residential history, Margaret had continued, 3 evictions for non-payment of rent, 2 small claims court judgments, a bankruptcy filing dismissed for failure to provide required documentation. Bradley had looked like he might be sick. Jessica, you told me you'd had some bad roommate situations. You never said anything about evictions or bankruptcies. Those were misunderstandings, Jessica had said, but she was crying now, and her voice carried the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around her. Margaret had closed her portfolio and leaned back in her chair, studying the 2 people who had spent 5 months systematically stealing from her while claiming to love her. I have one question, she'd said, her voice finally carrying some of the emotion she'd been suppressing for months. Did you plan this from the beginning, or did the opportunity just present itself after you moved in? Jessica had been crying too hard to answer, but Bradley had found his voice. Mom, we never meant for it to get this bad. We were just trying to get back on our feet. By lying to me about your financial situation, charging tens of thousands of dollars to my accounts without permission, and planning to steal my house? Bradley had looked genuinely confused. Steal your house? What are you talking about? Margaret had pulled out her phone and showed him the screenshots of Jessica's text messages about touring properties and researching senior living options for sellers who might be, quote, motivated to move. Your wife has been researching how to buy my house, Margaret had said. She's been consulting with mortgage brokers about family property transfers. She's been talking to estate planning attorneys about helping seniors transition housing responsibilities to younger family members. Bradley had turned to look at Jessica with an expression of complete betrayal. You were trying to buy Mom's house without telling me? It would have been good for everyone, Jessica had said through her tears. She's too old to live here alone. We would have taken care of everything. By forcing me out of my own home and manipulating me into signing over the deed? It's not manipulation. I'm planning ahead. You're 75 years old. What happens when you can't take care of yourself anymore? What happens when you fall down those stairs or have a medical emergency and nobody's here to help? Margaret had stood up, her patience finally exhausted. What happens, she'd said, her voice carrying the full authority of someone who'd spent 5 months being underestimated, is that I call the police if I need help. What happens is that I make my own decisions about my own life. What happens is that I don't let anyone, family or otherwise, steal from me and then claim they're doing me a favor. She'd walked to the front door and opened it, the evening air rushing in like a promise of freedom. You have 72 hours to remove yourselves and all your belongings from my house, she'd said. If you're not gone by Wednesday evening, the sheriff's department will assist with your departure. Jessica had looked up through her tears, seeming to realize for the first time that this wasn't a negotiation or a family therapy session. This was an eviction. You can't just kick us out, she'd said. We have rights. I'm pregnant. We have a child. You have the right to find somewhere else to live, Margaret had replied. You have the right to pay your own expenses with your own money. You have the right to stop lying to people who trusted you. Bradley had stood up, still holding the credit card statements like evidence of crimes he couldn't quite comprehend. Mom, can't we work something out? Maybe we made some mistakes, but we're family. Margaret had looked at her son, really looked at him, and seen not the boy she'd raised or the man she'd hoped he'd become, but a weak, passive enabler who'd stood by while his wife systematically abused his mother's generosity. Family doesn't steal from each other, she'd said. The family doesn't lie about their intentions. The family doesn't manipulate elderly relatives into giving up their homes and independence. She'd returned to her chair and opened her portfolio one final time, removing a document she hadn't shown them yet. I've also filed a complaint with the district attorney's office, she'd said. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Texas. The documented evidence suggests charges will be filed within the next few weeks. Jessica had stopped crying, her face going white with a terror that finally matched the magnitude of what she'd done. Criminal charges? $47,000 is well above the threshold for felony prosecution, Margaret had explained. Add in the fraudulent business claims, the identity theft involved in accessing my personal financial information, and the conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and you're looking at potentially several years in prison. Bradley had sunk back onto the sofa, the reality of their situation finally penetrating his willful blindness. What do you want us to do? He'd asked. Margaret had smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't a warm or forgiving expression. "I want you gone," she'd said. "I want full restitution for every penny you've stolen. And I want you to understand that your actions have consequences that extend far beyond this family meeting." Quote, she'd stood up and walked toward the stairs, leaving them sitting in the living room surrounded by the evidence of their crimes. 72 hours, she'd said without looking back. "Don't make me call the sheriff." Upstairs in her bedroom, Margaret had closed the door and called Dorothy Huang. "How did it go?" Dorothy had asked. "They're out," Margaret had replied. "File everything tomorrow morning." "Any threats? Any attempts at intimidation?" Margaret had looked out her bedroom window at the Dallas skyline, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Just tears," she'd said. "Lots and lots of tears." But the tears were just the beginning. Tomorrow, Jessica and Bradley would discover that crossing Margaret Chen hadn't just cost them a place to live. It was about to cost them everything. Monday morning broke gray and humid over Dallas, but Margaret Chen had never seen a more beautiful sunrise. She'd slept better than she had in months, waking at 5:30 not from anxiety but from the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped accommodating other people's cruelty. The house was unusually quiet. No sounds of Jessica's elaborate morning routine, no Emma's cheerful babbling, no Bradley's hurried preparation for work. Margaret had made her coffee in the kitchen, her own kitchen, and sat at the dining room table that was finally clear of Jessica's fictional business materials. At exactly 8 o'clock, Dorothy Huang had called with an update that made Margaret's coffee taste even sweeter. "All documents filed," Dorothy had reported. "Civil complaint for financial elder abuse, restitution demand, restraining order, and criminal referral to the DA's office. The sheriff's department will serve papers this afternoon." "How long before they have to respond?" "They have 30 days to file an answer to the civil complaint, but the restraining order is effective immediately. If they're not out of your house by Wednesday evening, they'll be arrested for violation of a court order." Margaret had hung up and called her sister Linda in Phoenix, sharing the news with someone who'd been urging her to take action for months. "I'm proud of you, Maggie," Linda had said. "Dad always said you had more steel in your spine than anybody gave you credit for." Their father had been dead 15 years, but his voice still carried weight in Margaret's memory. He'd been a small business owner who'd built his success on the principle that respect had to be earned and boundaries had to be enforced. He would have approved of Margaret's methodical approach to justice. The first sign that Jessica and Bradley understood the severity of their situation had come at 9:15, when Margaret heard raised voices through the ceiling. Jessica's voice, high and desperate, was answered by Bradley's deeper tones, carrying a strain Margaret had never heard before. She'd positioned herself in the kitchen, ostensibly making Emma's breakfast but actually listening to fragments of conversation that drifted down through the old house's thin floors. "Criminal charges, never said anything about, how are we supposed to know?" $47,000, Jessica. Where did you think the money was coming from?" "Not my fault. She gave us access to her accounts. She offered to help." Margaret had poured orange juice into Emma's sippy cup, marveling at Jessica's ability to reframe systematic theft as Margaret's failure to protect herself adequately. Even facing potential felony charges, Jessica couldn't acknowledge responsibility for her own actions. At 10:30, Bradley had appeared in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, carrying Emma on his hip. His face looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, and his hands were shaking as he poured coffee into one of the white ceramic mugs Jessica had chosen to replace Margaret's mismatched collection. "Mom," he'd said, his voice carefully controlled, "can we talk? Please?" Margaret had looked at her granddaughter, who was reaching for her grandmother with the uncomplicated affection of a 2-year-old who didn't understand that her world was about to change dramatically. "Of course," Margaret had said, taking Emma from Bradley's arms and settling her in the high chair with the breakfast Margaret had prepared. "What would you like to discuss?" Bradley had sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same spot where they'd shared countless meals when he was growing up. But this conversation would be different from any they'd ever had. "Jessica's upstairs crying," he'd said. "She's scared about the criminal charges. She says she never meant for things to go this far." Margaret had fed Emma a spoonful of scrambled eggs, taking her time before responding. What did she think would happen when she stole $47,000 from me? She didn't think of it as stealing. She thought of it as family helping family. Margaret had set down the spoon and looked directly at her son. Bradley, did you think of it as family helping family when you charged spa appointments to my credit card, when you bought designer clothes with my money, when you went on weekend trips that I paid for while telling me you couldn't afford to help with groceries? Bradley had looked down at his coffee mug, unable to maintain eye contact. I didn't know about all of that. Jessica handled most of the financial stuff. You didn't ask where the money was coming from? I trusted her. Margaret had resumed feeding Emma, but her voice had carried the edge of someone whose patience was approaching its limit. You trusted her, but you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth about your financial situation. You didn't trust me enough to ask for help honestly. You trusted her to manage stolen money, but you didn't trust me to say no if I couldn't afford to help. The truth of this had settled between them like a lead weight. Bradley had spent 5 months enabling Jessica's systematic abuse of his mother because it was easier than taking responsibility for his own financial failures. What can we do to fix this? Bradley had asked. You can pay me back every penny you stole. You can move out of my house today instead of waiting until Wednesday. And you can accept responsibility for what you've done instead of pretending you were an innocent victim of Jessica's schemes. Bradley had looked up with a flicker of hope. If we pay you back, will you drop the criminal charges? Margaret had wiped Emma's face with a damp cloth, buying herself time to choose her words carefully. The criminal charges aren't negotiable, she'd said. Jessica didn't just steal from me. She's done this before, to other people, and she'll do it again to future victims if there aren't serious consequences. But I'm your son. Yes, you are, and that makes your betrayal worse, not better. The sheriff's deputies had arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, 2 uniformed officers who'd approached the situation with the professional detachment of people who'd served hundreds of similar documents. Margaret had watched from her living room window as Jessica answered the door, still in her robe, her face puffy from hours of crying. The lead deputy had handed her a manila envelope and explained her legal obligations in the kind of neutral tone that made clear this was routine business, not personal drama. Jessica had tried to argue, her voice carrying across the front yard as she demanded to know how this was legal, how a family dispute could become a criminal matter, how she was supposed to find somewhere to live with a toddler and another baby on the way. The deputy had listened politely, then repeated the information about her legal obligations and the consequences for non-compliance. 30 days to respond to the civil complaint. 72 hours to vacate the premises. No contact with Margaret Chen except through attorneys. After the deputies left, the house had filled with the sounds of frantic packing. Suitcases being dragged downstairs, boxes being hastily filled. Phone calls to friends and family members who might provide temporary housing. Margaret had stayed in her bedroom, reading a novel and letting them manage their own crisis. She'd helped them enough. At 4 o'clock, her phone rang, Jessica's number, which Margaret had let go to voicemail. The message had been a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as an apology. Margaret, I know you're angry, and I understand why. I made some mistakes, and I should have communicated better about our financial arrangements. But please think about Emma. She loves living here with her grandmother. She doesn't understand why her world is being turned upside down. Can't we work something out that's best for everyone? I'm willing to pay you back over time, and we can be more careful about expenses going forward. Please call me back so we can discuss this like adults. Margaret had deleted the message without calling back. Jessica's definition of discussing this like adults apparently meant negotiating a deal that would allow her to avoid consequences while maintaining access to Margaret's resources. The second voicemail had come an hour later, this time with a different tone. I don't understand why you're being so vindictive about this. We're family, and family is supposed to forgive each other. I'm pregnant, and you're putting stress on your unborn grandchild. I never thought you could be so cold and heartless. But fine. If this is how you want to handle things, don't expect me to bring Emma around to visit after we move out. You're destroying your relationship with your granddaughter over money. Quote. That message Margaret had saved, because it perfectly illustrated Jessica's strategy of alternating between false apologies and emotional manipulation. It would be useful evidence if Jessica tried to claim she'd been cooperative or remorseful. Tuesday morning brought a new development. Margaret had been in her garden, deadheading her roses and enjoying the first peaceful morning she'd experienced in months, when her neighbor Mrs. Patterson had approached the fence between their properties. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are Bradley and Jessica moving out? I saw the sheriff's deputies yesterday, and there's been a lot of activity over there." Margaret had looked up from her roses, considering how much to share with a neighbor who'd been nothing but kind during the difficult months. "They're finding their own place," she'd said diplomatically. "The arrangement wasn't working out as well as we'd hoped." Mrs. Patterson had nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize euphemisms. "I'm glad to hear it," she said. "I was worried about you. You seemed diminished lately, not yourself." The word diminished had hit Margaret like a physical blow, because it was exactly accurate. She had been diminished, reduced, erased a little more each day, until she'd almost forgotten who she used to be. "I'm feeling much more like myself again," Margaret had replied. That afternoon, Margaret had received a call from Detective Lisa Rodriguez, with the Dallas Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "Mrs. Chen, I've reviewed the documentation you provided through your attorney. I wanted to let you know that we're opening a formal investigation into the financial abuse allegations." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means we'll be conducting interviews, reviewing financial records, and potentially pursuing criminal charges. Based on the evidence you've provided, this appears to be a clear case of elder financial abuse with aggravating circumstances." Aggravating circumstances? The amount involved, the systematic nature of the abuse, the suspect's prior history of similar offenses, and the family relationship that was exploited to gain access to your accounts. Margaret had felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest. The system was working. Justice was methodical, thorough, and inevitable. "How long does the investigation typically take?" "Several weeks to a few months, depending on the complexity. But I can tell you that cases with this level of documentation rarely result in dismissed charges." Wednesday evening had arrived with the kind of dramatic thunderstorm that made Dallas feel like the set of a Western movie. Margaret had been reading in her living room. Her living room, arranged according to her preferences for the first time in months, when she'd heard the moving truck pull into her driveway. She'd watched from her window as Bradley and Jessica loaded their belongings, their movements hurried and desperate. Emma had cried every time someone carried her toys or furniture toward the truck, not understanding why her familiar world was being packed away. Jessica had made several trips past Margaret's window, probably hoping for some sign that forgiveness was still possible, that the criminal charges might be negotiable, that this nightmare might still be reversible. Margaret had continued reading her book. At 8:30, Bradley had knocked on her door one final time. He'd stood on her porch holding Emma, both of them looking exhausted and defeated. "We're leaving now," he'd said. "Is there anything you want to say?" Margaret had looked at her granddaughter, who was reaching for her with the trust of a child who didn't understand that adults sometimes made choices that hurt the people they were supposed to protect. "I want to say that I love Emma, and I hope someday she'll understand why her grandmother had to choose self-respect over keeping the peace." She'd kissed Emma's forehead and stepped back into her house, closing the door gently, but firmly. Through her living room window, she'd watched the moving truck disappear into the storm, carrying with it 5 months of the most difficult accommodation she'd ever endured. The house had felt enormous and quiet, but it was a good quiet. The quiet of someone who'd finally stopped explaining herself to people who'd never intended to listen. Margaret had made herself a cup of tea in her own kitchen, using one of her mismatched mugs that she'd retrieved from storage. She'd sat at her dining room table, which was clear and available for her own use. And for the first time in months, she'd felt like she was home. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served with compound interest. Now comes the rebuilding. 3 months after the moving truck disappeared into that thunderstorm, Margaret Chen stood in her kitchen making scones for 12 people instead of just herself. But these weren't the family members who'd stolen from her and manipulated her kindness into weakness. These were the women who'd started gathering in her living room every Tuesday morning, drawn together by shared experiences and the kind of hard-won wisdom that only came from surviving other people's attempts to erase you. The Elder Advocacy Support Group had begun accidentally. Dorothy Huang had mentioned Margaret's case during a presentation at the Dallas Bar Association, focusing on the legal strategies for combating family financial abuse. Word had spread through social networks, senior centers, and medical offices until Margaret's phone started ringing with calls from women who'd heard her story and recognized their own. "I thought I was the only one," had been the refrain from caller after caller. Women whose adult children had moved in temporarily and never left. Women whose savings had evaporated through family members' emergencies that never seemed to end. Women who'd been made to feel selfish for wanting control over their own lives and resources. The first meeting had been just Margaret and 3 other women, sitting in her living room and sharing stories that sounded like variations on the same cruel theme. But word of mouth was powerful, and by the 3rd week, Margaret had been setting up folding chairs to accommodate the growing group. Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired sociology professor, had provided the academic framework for what they were all experiencing. Elder financial abuse is the fastest growing form of domestic violence in America, she'd explained during her guest presentation. And family-perpetrated abuse is the most difficult to prosecute because it exploits the victim's own love and loyalty. The statistics had been staggering. Older Americans lost an estimated $36 billion annually to financial abuse, with family members responsible for nearly 60% of cases. Most victims never reported the abuse, either from shame or from fear of destroying family relationships. The average victim loses $120,000, Dr. Williams had continued, but the psychological damage often exceeds the financial harm. Victims report feeling betrayed, humiliated, and powerless in ways that money can't measure. Margaret had nodded, along with 11 other women who understood exactly what those feelings looked like from the inside. The group had evolved beyond just sharing stories. They'd become a resource network, a support system, and occasionally, a force for justice. When 78-year-old Helen Morrison had discovered her nephew stealing her Social Security checks, it was the group that helped her navigate the legal system and find pro bono representation. When Rita Gonzalez's daughter had tried to force her into signing over power of attorney, it was the group that connected her with elder rights attorneys and helped her document the attempted coercion. Margaret's own case had become something of a legend in Dallas legal circles. The systematic documentation, the forensic accounting, the strategic timing of the legal offensive, law schools were using it as a case study in effective advocacy for elder abuse victims. Jessica's criminal trial had concluded 6 weeks earlier with a plea agreement. Felony financial exploitation of an elderly person, reduced from the original charges in exchange for full restitution and 18 months of probation. She'd also been required to perform 200 hours of community service with seniors, a particularly appropriate form of justice that Margaret had specifically requested. Bradley's involvement had been addressed through the civil lawsuit. As the beneficiary of Jessica's stolen funds, he was held jointly liable for the full $47,247.83, plus interest, court costs, and Margaret's attorney fees. The final judgment had been just over $63,000. Paying it had required Bradley to sell his car, liquidate his retirement account, and take a second job delivering food on weekends. The financial strain had apparently contributed to marital problems that culminated in Jessica filing for divorce 3 weeks after her sentencing. Margaret had learned these details not from Bradley. They hadn't spoken since the night he'd moved out, but from her sister Linda, who'd maintained contact with her nephew despite his betrayal of their mother. "He's living in a studio apartment now," Linda had reported during one of their weekly phone calls. Jessica took Emma and moved back to Oklahoma to live with her parents. "He gets visitation every other weekend, but the drive is expensive, and he's working 2 jobs. Margaret had listened to these updates with the detached interest of someone reviewing the aftermath of a natural disaster. Bradley had made his choices, and choices had consequences. The fact that those consequences were difficult didn't make them unjust. What surprised her was how little satisfaction she felt from Bradley's suffering. She'd expected vindication, perhaps even a sense of righteous triumph. Instead, she felt mostly sad that it had taken legal intervention to teach her own son basic concepts about respect and boundaries. The real transformation had been internal. Margaret had spent 75 years believing that kindness meant accommodation, that love meant sacrifice, that family meant accepting unacceptable behavior to keep the peace. The woman who emerged from that experience understood that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Her relationship with Emma had been the most painful casualty. Jessica had made good on her threat to limit contact, using Margaret's vindictive behavior as justification for keeping Emma away from her grandmother. Margaret received photos and updates through Linda, but she hadn't seen her granddaughter since the night they'd moved out. The loss ached in ways that money couldn't heal, but Margaret had learned to contextualize even this grief. Emma was young enough that she'd adapt to her new circumstances. If Margaret's actions had prevented Jessica from successfully completing her house-stealing scheme, then Emma would benefit in the long run from having a grandmother who'd modeled self-respect instead of victimhood. The financial recovery had been complete but slow. The restitution payments came in monthly installments, automatically deducted from Bradley's paychecks through a court-ordered wage garnishment. Margaret had deposited each payment into a separate account earmarked for the Elder Advocacy Support Group's activities. "I don't want money that was stolen from me," she'd explained to Dorothy during one of their regular coffee meetings, "but I can use it to prevent other people from being stolen from." The group's advocacy work had expanded beyond emotional support. They'd lobbied the city council for stronger elder protection ordinances. They'd partnered with local banks to develop training programs for employees to recognize signs of financial abuse. They'd created informational materials that were now distributed through senior centers, medical offices, and social service agencies. Margaret's personal story had become a teaching tool, but she'd been careful to focus on prevention and empowerment rather than revenge. When she spoke at conferences or support groups, she emphasized the importance of documentation, legal consultation, and early intervention. "The goal isn't to punish family members," she'd explained during a presentation at the Dallas Senior Center. "The goal is to protect yourself and prevent future victimization. Sometimes those two things require legal action, but that's a last resort, not a first impulse." Her house had been transformed as well. The rooms Jessica had redesigned according to her aesthetic preferences had been restored to Margaret's original vision. The dining room table was clear and available for Margaret's client work, which had expanded as word spread about her advocacy activities. Small business owners appreciated working with an accountant who understood the importance of protecting assets from family members with boundary issues. The basement office space had been converted into a meeting room for the support group, equipped with comfortable seating, a small kitchenette, and a library of resources about elder rights, financial protection, and legal advocacy. Margaret had installed a separate entrance so group members could come and go without disrupting her household routine. Most evenings, she cooked dinner for one and ate while reading mystery novels or working on the memoir she'd started writing at Dorothy's suggestion. The working title was Invisible Number More, A Guide to Surviving Family Financial Abuse, and it was scheduled for publication the following year through a small press that specialized in self-advocacy guides. The loneliness she'd feared after forcing Bradley and Jessica to leave had never materialized. Instead, she'd discovered the difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone was peaceful. Alone was having space to think her own thoughts and make her own choices. Alone was not having to explain or justify or compromise her comfort for other people's convenience. Lonely was what she'd felt during those 5 months when she'd been surrounded by people who'd treated her like an obstacle to their own happiness. The phone rang as she was arranging the scones on her grandmother's china serving plate. It was Detective Rodriguez with an update about another case that had been referred through the support group network. "The Henderson case is moving forward," Detective Rodriguez reported. "The documentation your group helped compile was excellent. We're expecting to file charges next week." Quote. Margaret smiled as she balanced the phone against her shoulder while arranging napkins. Mrs. Henderson will be relieved? She was worried that no one would believe her about her son-in-law's credit card fraud. Believe me, with the evidence you helped her gather, belief isn't an issue. This is going to be a textbook prosecution. After hanging up, Margaret reflected on how naturally she'd assumed the role of victim advocate. Part of it was her professional background in forensic accounting, but mostly it was the hard-earned understanding that came from surviving manipulation and choosing justice over family harmony. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, signaling the arrival of her Tuesday morning group. Margaret opened the door to find 12 women of various ages, backgrounds, and circumstances, united by their shared experience of financial exploitation and their commitment to preventing other victims. "Morning, Margaret," called out Carmen Reyes, a 72-year-old former teacher whose daughter had stolen her pension fund. "Those scones smell incredible." "The secret ingredient is refusing to let other people's problems become your emergencies," Margaret replied, earning knowing laughter from women who understood that humor was sometimes the only way to process trauma. As the group settled into the living room that had once been dominated by Jessica's aesthetic preferences, Margaret looked around at faces that had become familiar and important to her. These were relationships built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of honesty that was only possible between people who'd stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. During the meeting, they discussed 3 new cases that had been referred through their network. A 79-year-old man whose grandson was stealing his medication and selling it. A 68-year-old woman whose nephew had convinced her to co-sign loans he'd never intended to repay. An 82-year-old widower whose caregiver was systematically emptying his bank accounts. Each case was approached with the same methodical strategy Margaret had learned from her own experience. Document everything, consult with professionals, pursue legal remedies when necessary, and never apologize for protecting yourself from people who'd exploited your trust. After the meeting, Margaret had lunch with Dorothy at their favorite cafe downtown. Their friendship had deepened beyond attorney-client privilege into something that felt like sisterhood. "Any regrets?" Dorothy asked, over salads and iced tea. Margaret considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible in her own home, accommodating people who'd mistaken her kindness for weakness and her love for limitless tolerance. Today, she was a published advocate, a community leader, and a woman who'd learned the difference between family harmony and family peace. "I regret that it took me so long to find my voice," she said finally. "I regret that Emma is caught in the middle of adult choices she didn't make, but I don't regret refusing to be a victim." That afternoon, Margaret returned home to find an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Emma, at what looked like a birthday party, wearing a pink dress and grinning at the camera with frosting on her cheek. On the back, someone had written in Bradley's handwriting, "She asks about Grandma Margaret sometimes." Margaret studied the photo for a long time, memorizing Emma's face and hoping that someday her granddaughter would understand that love sometimes required difficult choices. That boundaries weren't walls built to keep people out, but foundations built to keep important things safe. She placed the photo in the frame on her nightstand, next to the picture of David and the copy of her book contract. Evidence of love that had endured, justice that had prevailed, and a life that had been reclaimed from people who'd assumed she was too old, too kind, or too accommodating to fight back. Margaret Chen had spent 75 years learning to be generous with people she cared about. At 76, she'd learned to be generous with herself as well. The transformation was complete, but the advocacy work, helping other invisible women become visible again, was just beginning. Outside her window, Dallas glittered in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities and people who deserved better than they'd been accepting. Margaret finished her tea, checked her calendar for the evening's consultation with another potential client, and smiled at the woman reflected in her kitchen window. She looked like someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in her own life. She looked like someone who'd remembered that respect was earned, not inherited, and that family was defined by behavior, not blood. She looked like someone who'd finally learned that the opposite of smelling like death wasn't smelling like anything else. It was smelling like life fully lived, boundaries firmly established, and justice finally served. And that, Margaret thought as she prepared for another client meeting, was a fragrance worth wearing every single day. The evening consultation was with Maria Santos, a 63-year-old nurse whose adult son had convinced her to refinance her paid-off house to fund his, quote, investment opportunities. Maria sat across from Margaret's dining room table, her hands shaking as she spread out bank statements that told a familiar story of trust exploited and boundaries obliterated. He said the real estate market was booming, Maria whispered, her voice carrying the shame that all victims seemed to share. He said we'd double our money within 6 months. That was 2 years ago. Margaret reviewed the documentation with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen this pattern dozens of times. The initial legitimate-sounding investment proposal. The gradual expansion of financial requests. The emotional manipulation when questions were raised. The final revelation that no investments had ever been made. "Where's the money now?" Margaret asked gently. Maria's laugh was bitter. "Gone. All of it." He spent it on a motorcycle, a trip to Vegas, and what he called, quote, business expenses, that turned out to be designer clothes and expensive restaurants. Margaret made notes on her legal pad, calculating the scope of theft and potential recovery options. $68,000 from the house refinancing, plus another $22,000 from Maria's retirement account. Substantial enough for felony charges, recent enough that asset recovery might be possible. "Have you confronted him about this?" "I tried. He said I was being dramatic, that investments take time, that I should trust him because he's my son." Maria wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Then last week I found out he's been telling people I have dementia, that I'm confused about money and he's helping manage my finances." The gasoline on fire moment Margaret recognized. The point where financial abuse crossed into psychological warfare designed to undermine the victim's credibility and autonomy. "Maria, I need you to understand something very clearly," Margaret said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd learned this lesson at great personal cost. "Your son isn't helping you. He's systematically destroying your financial security and trying to convince other people that you're incompetent so they won't believe you when you ask for help." Maria nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe families are supposed to help each other this way." "Families help each other by being honest about needs and respectful of boundaries," Margaret replied. "What your son is doing is theft with a family discount on guilt." They spent 90 minutes reviewing Maria's options, documentation strategies to establish her mental competence, legal consultation with Dorothy's firm, financial analysis to trace where the stolen money had gone, emotional preparation for the family conflict that would inevitably follow when Maria stopped enabling her son's theft. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Margaret warned as Maria prepared to leave. "He's going to accuse you of being ungrateful, selfish, mentally unstable, whatever it takes to make you back down. But you have to remember that his anger is proof you're doing the right thing." After Maria left, Margaret cleaned up the teacups and reflected on how many similar conversations she'd had over the past few months. The details changed. Sometimes it was daughters instead of sons, sometimes grandchildren instead of adult children. Sometimes the theft involved credit cards instead of refinanced houses. But the emotional dynamics were always identical. Predators who exploited family relationships to access resources they hadn't earned. Victims who'd been conditioned to believe that refusing exploitation made them bad family members. Extended family and friends who enabled the abuse by refusing to acknowledge its severity. Margaret's phone rang at 8:30. Dorothy's voice carried an excitement that meant good news. "The Henderson case resulted in a guilty plea," Dorothy announced. "Full restitution, 2 years probation, and mandatory financial management counseling." "How's Mrs. Henderson handling it?" "Better than expected. She said she finally feels like someone believes her story." That was the recurring theme in all their successful cases. Not just financial recovery, but the restoration of dignity that came from having official acknowledgement that they'd been wronged. Many victims had been gaslit for so long that they'd started questioning their own perceptions of reality. Any word on the Santos consultation I referred to? Quote, "Meeting with her Thursday. The documentation you helped her compile is solid. Her son's going to have a very unpleasant conversation with the prosecutor." Margaret hung up, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from systemic justice. Each successful case created precedent, improved law enforcement understanding of elder financial abuse, and sent a message to potential perpetrators that these crimes had serious consequences. The memoir writing had become her evening ritual. Margaret would pour herself a glass of wine, settle into David's old recliner, and work on chapters that chronicled not just her own experience, but the stories of dozens of women who'd shared their experiences through the support group. The publisher had been enthusiastic about the book's potential impact. Elder abuse is finally getting the attention it deserves, her editor had explained during their last phone call. But most of the coverage focuses on institutional abuse in nursing homes. Your book addresses family abuse, which is much more common, but much less discussed. The chapter she was working on tonight dealt with the psychology of family financial predators. Margaret had interviewed Dr. Patricia Williams extensively about the personality types that were drawn to exploiting elderly relatives. They're often people who've struggled with financial responsibility their entire lives, Dr. Williams had explained. They see an elderly family member's accumulated wealth as an inheritance they're entitled to receive early. They rationalize the theft by claiming they're providing care or companionship in exchange. The most dangerous predators, according to Dr. Williams, were those who combined financial desperation with narcissistic personality traits. They genuinely believed their needs were more important than their victims' security, and they were skilled at manipulating both victims and bystanders into supporting their narrative. Jessica was a textbook example, Margaret had told Dr. Williams during one of their recorded interviews. She had a history of financial instability, a talent for manipulation, and enough charm to make people want to believe her stories about business ventures and temporary hardship. Margaret's computer chimed with an email notification, a message from a woman in Phoenix who'd heard about the support group through Linda's social network. Another story of adult children who'd moved in temporarily and systematically stolen their parents' financial security. These emails arrived several times a week now as word spread through senior centers, legal aid organizations, and social service agencies. Margaret had started maintaining a database of contacts, attorneys who specialized in elder law, private investigators who understood financial crimes, social workers who could provide emotional support during legal proceedings. The network was becoming larger and more sophisticated, with satellite support groups forming in other cities and states. Margaret had been invited to speak at conferences in Houston, Phoenix, and Atlanta, sharing strategies that had proven effective in Texas cases. Her calendar for the following month included 3 speaking engagements, 2 television interviews, and a consultation with the Texas Legislature's Committee on Elder Rights. The bill they were considering would strengthen penalties for family financial abuse and create specialized law enforcement units trained to investigate these cases. "You've become a celebrity," Dorothy had teased during their last coffee meeting. "I've become a survivor," Margaret had corrected. "There's a difference." Celebrity suggested glamour and attention for its own sake. Survival suggested the hard work of rebuilding a life after someone else had tried to destroy it. Margaret's advocacy work wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making sure other women didn't have to endure what she'd experienced. The house phone rang at 9:15, an unusual time for calls. The caller ID showed Linda's Phoenix number. "Maggie, I have news," Linda said without preamble. "Bradley called me tonight." Margaret set down her wine glass, preparing herself for whatever complication her son had decided to introduce into her carefully reconstructed life. What did he want? "To tell me that Jessica's been arrested in Oklahoma. Something about check fraud involving her new boyfriend's grandmother." Margaret felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because it proved Jessica was indeed a career criminal who'd moved on to new victims. Sadness because it meant Emma was living with a mother whose criminal behavior was escalating rather than improving. Is Emma safe? Bradley's driving to Oklahoma this weekend to pick her up. Jessica's parents can't handle a 2-year-old, and apparently the new boyfriend isn't interested in instant fatherhood. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process the implications. Emma would be coming back to Dallas to live with Bradley, who was working 2 jobs and living in a studio apartment barely large enough for one person, let alone a toddler. What's he going to do? He was hoping. Linda paused, and Margaret could hear the careful way she was choosing her words. He was wondering if you might be willing to help with childcare while he works. Just during the day. He'd pick her up every evening. The request hit Margaret like a physical blow. After months of no contact, after all the legal proceedings and financial judgments, Bradley wanted her to resume her role as the accommodating grandmother, who provided free services when they became convenient. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought he had a lot of nerve asking, considering how he'd treated you. But I also told him I'd pass along the message because Emma is innocent in all this." Margaret stared out her kitchen window at the Dallas skyline, thinking about the 2-year-old who'd been shuttled between unstable adults and uncertain living situations through no fault of her own. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course you do. But Maggie, whatever you decide, make sure it's what's best for you, not what's expected of you." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her quiet house and considered the request that would have seemed routine 6 months ago but now felt loaded with complex implications. Helping with Emma's childcare would mean resuming contact with Bradley, potentially opening herself to manipulation or renewed attempts to exploit her generosity. But it would also mean having a relationship with her granddaughter, who would otherwise grow up believing her grandmother had abandoned her, rather than learning the truth about why their family had been fractured. The decision would require careful consideration, clear boundaries, and probably legal documentation to prevent Bradley from assuming that childcare assistance meant a return to the financial exploitation that had nearly destroyed Margaret's sense of self. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Dorothy, outlining the situation and requesting advice about how to protect herself while potentially helping Emma. Because Margaret Chen had learned that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was enabling. And she'd learned that lesson too well to forget it now, even for a granddaughter she missed more than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. The night stretched ahead, full of decisions that would determine not just Emma's immediate welfare, but the future of relationships that had been severed by betrayal and might possibly be rebuilt through careful, conditional trust. Margaret poured herself another glass of wine and began making lists. Potential benefits, probable risks, necessary safeguards, and non-negotiable conditions. Because even second chances required first-class preparation. And Margaret Chen had become very, very good at preparation. The following morning brought clarity with the sunrise. Margaret had spent the night reviewing her decision-making process, and by 6 a.m., she knew exactly what conditions would need to be met before she'd consider helping with Emma's childcare. Her first call was to Dorothy, who listened to the situation with the analytical attention of someone who'd seen too many good intentions lead to renewed exploitation. "What's your gut telling you?" Dorothy asked. "That Emma deserves stability, but I deserve protection from people who've already proven they'll take advantage of my generosity." "Smart distinction. So what are you thinking?" Margaret consulted the notes she'd made during her sleepless night. Formal, written agreement. Specific hours, specific compensation, specific boundaries about what I will and won't provide. No access to my house when I'm not present. No discussion of financial assistance beyond the agreed-upon childcare arrangement. "Compensation?" Dorothy sounded surprised. "Absolutely. The last time I provided free family assistance, it cost me $47,000. This time, Bradley pays market rate for professional childcare services." Dorothy's laugh carried approval. "You've learned the difference between helping and enabling." "I've learned that people value what they pay for and take advantage of what they get for free." The conversation continued for 40 minutes, with Dorothy helping Margaret draft a preliminary agreement that would protect her legally and emotionally. Hourly rate comparable to licensed daycare facilities. Written schedule that couldn't be changed without 24 hours' notice. Termination clause that allowed Margaret to end the arrangement immediately if Bradley violated any conditions. "Most importantly," Dorothy emphasized, "everything goes through me. He doesn't negotiate directly with you. He doesn't discuss modifications to the agreement. He doesn't ask for additional favors or exceptions. All communication about this arrangement goes through legal counsel." Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of having professional expertise applied to personal situations. Bradley would either accept the formal, businesslike arrangement or find other childcare options. Either way, Margaret would be protected from manipulation. Her second call was to Linda, who'd been expecting to hear Margaret's decision. "I'll help Emma under specific professional conditions," Margaret explained. But I need you to make something clear to Bradley. This isn't a reconciliation. This isn't forgiveness. This is a business arrangement designed to benefit Emma while protecting me from any renewed attempts at financial or emotional manipulation. That's harsh, Maggie. That's realistic. Bradley had the opportunity to treat me with respect and honesty, and he chose to enable someone who was systematically stealing from me. Now he gets professional boundaries instead of family accommodations. Linda sighed. You've gotten harder since all this happened. I've gotten smarter. There's a difference. The third call was to Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd become both a professional collaborator and personal mentor during Margaret's transformation from victim to advocate. I'm concerned about your emotional exposure, Dr. Williams said after hearing about Bradley's request. Renewed contact with Emma will inevitably involve renewed contact with Bradley, and that relationship carries significant psychological risks. What kind of risks? Regression to old patterns, the temptation to accommodate unreasonable requests for Emma's sake, gradual erosion of the boundaries you've established. Bradley hasn't demonstrated any genuine accountability for his role in the financial abuse, just consequences he wants to avoid. Margaret made notes while Dr. Williams continued her analysis. Additionally, there's the risk that Emma herself could become a tool for manipulation. Children are naturally affectionate, and Bradley might use Emma's attachment to you as leverage for additional requests or concessions. So you think I should refuse? Quote, I think you should proceed with extreme caution and multiple safeguards. Professional supervision, documented boundaries, regular check-ins with objective observers who can identify early signs of boundary erosion. Margaret spent the afternoon drafting a comprehensive response to Bradley's request, channeling 35 years of business communication skills into a document that left no room for misinterpretation. The letter outlined her willingness to provide professional childcare services for Emma under specific conditions. Market rate compensation paid weekly in advance. Fixed schedule with no deviation except for documented emergencies. No access to Margaret's house outside of childcare hours. No discussion of financial assistance, loans, or other family obligations. Most importantly, the arrangement would be reviewed monthly with the option for either party to terminate with 2 weeks' notice. Margaret wasn't committing to permanent accommodation. She was offering a professional service that could be discontinued if Bradley reverted to his previous patterns of entitlement and exploitation. She mailed the letter to Bradley's apartment, with copies to Dorothy and Linda for documentation purposes. Whatever his response, there would be no ambiguity about the terms of Margaret's assistance or the consequences for violating them. That evening's support group meeting included 8 women, 3 of whom were dealing with ongoing legal proceedings against family members who'd exploited their financial resources. The newest member was Sandra Mitchell, a 70-year-old retired librarian whose daughter had convinced her to co-sign a business loan that was now in default. She said the library was downsizing and I needed to think about alternative income sources, Sandra explained to the group. She had this whole presentation about the food truck business, with projected revenues and customer demographics. It all seemed so professional. Margaret recognized the familiar elements: sophisticated-sounding business proposals, emotional manipulation about the victim's financial security, and the exploitation of family trust to access credit or assets. How much was the loan? Asked Carmen Reyes. $85,000. The food truck cost $60,000, and the rest was supposed to be working capital for the first year of operation. And now? Sandra's voice dropped to a whisper. The truck was repossessed 3 months ago. My daughter spent the working capital on personal expenses. Rent, car payments, shopping. The loan payments are $4,000 a month, and she's been unemployed since the food truck failed. Margaret pulled out her legal pad and began taking notes. Another case that would require documentation, legal consultation, and probably criminal referral. Sandra, have you kept records of where the loan money actually went? Some. I have bank statements showing transfers from the business account to her personal account. I have receipts for things that were obviously personal rather than business expenses. Good. We'll need all of that. Have you confronted your daughter about the loan default? Sandra nodded miserably. She said it wasn't her fault the food truck business was harder than expected. She said I should have researched the market better before agreeing to co-sign. She said she's looking for work, but good jobs are hard to find. The group exchanged knowing looks. The classic deflection strategy, blaming the victim for not protecting themselves adequately while refusing accountability for the deception that made protection necessary. Sandra, Margaret said gently, your daughter didn't fail at the food truck business. She stole $85,000 from you and used a fake business plan to make the theft look legitimate. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with each woman sharing updates on their legal proceedings, emotional recovery, and strategies for preventing future victimization. Margaret noticed how naturally they'd developed a support system that provided both practical assistance and emotional validation. After the meeting, Margaret cleaned up while reflecting on how much her life had changed in just 8 months. The woman who'd accommodated Jessica's gradually escalating demands would never have imagined herself leading support groups for financial abuse victims or consulting with law enforcement about prosecution strategies. Her phone rang as she was loading the dishwasher, Bradley's number, which she almost didn't answer. Mom, Bradley's voice was carefully controlled, probably rehearsed. I got your letter. And? I understand your concerns, but some of these conditions seem pretty harsh. I mean, paying you to watch Emma when you're her grandmother? Margaret had expected this reaction. Bradley still didn't understand that his actions had transformed their relationship from family accommodation to professional transaction. Bradley, the last time I provided free family assistance, it cost me nearly $50,000 and months of legal proceedings. This time, I'm treating childcare as the business arrangement it actually is. But Emma's your granddaughter. Doesn't that mean anything to you? The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable, using Emma's relationship to Margaret as leverage for special treatment that Bradley hadn't earned through his own behavior. Emma means everything to me, Margaret replied, which is why I'm willing to provide professional childcare services under conditions that protect both of us from the kind of exploitation that destroyed our family relationships the first time. I can't afford to pay market rate for full-time childcare. That's why I was hoping for family help. Then you'll need to find alternative arrangements. Subsidized daycare, family members who are willing to provide free services, or a job with hours that accommodate Emma's schedule. The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if Bradley had hung up. This isn't the mom I remember, he said finally. The mom you remember was taken advantage of by people she trusted. The mom you're talking to now has learned the difference between helping and enabling. So that's it? You won't help unless I pay you? Margaret felt the familiar tug of guilt, the old instinct to accommodate and apologize and make other people's problems easier to solve. But she'd learned to recognize that feeling as a warning signal rather than a moral imperative. I'm offering to help under conditions that protect both of us, she said. You can accept those conditions or decline them, but they're not negotiable. Bradley hung up without saying goodbye, leaving Margaret staring at her phone and wondering if she'd just sacrificed her relationship with Emma for the sake of maintaining boundaries with her son. The answer came 2 days later in the form of another phone call from Linda. He's taking the deal, Linda reported. He's not happy about it, but Jessica's situation in Oklahoma is getting worse, and he needs reliable childcare. Margaret felt relief mixed with apprehension. Seeing Emma again would be wonderful, but renewed contact with Bradley carried risks that would require constant vigilance. When does he want to start? Next Monday. He'll drop Emma off at 8 and pick her up at 6, Monday through Friday. He's agreed to all your conditions, including the weekly payment in advance. Quote, how did he sound about it? Resentful, but desperate. He still doesn't think he should have to pay his mother for childcare, but he's out of other options. That evening, Margaret prepared her house for Emma's return. She'd kept some of Emma's toys in storage, along with the high chair and other childcare equipment that had been left behind during the chaotic move-out. But this time, the toys would be put away each evening, and the childcare equipment would remain in the designated areas rather than taking over the entire house. She also prepared herself emotionally for the complex feelings that would inevitably arise from caring for Emma while maintaining professional boundaries with Bradley. Love for her granddaughter complicated by resentment toward her son, joy at renewed contact tempered by vigilance against manipulation. The memoir chapter she worked on that night dealt with the challenge of maintaining boundaries in ongoing relationships with family members who'd violated trust. Dr. Williams had provided insights about the psychological dynamics involved in partial reconciliation. The victim wants to rebuild the relationship but can't forget the betrayal, Dr. Williams had explained. The perpetrator wants to return to the previous dynamic but doesn't want to acknowledge the harm they caused. Both parties are operating from different definitions of what reconciliation should look like. Margaret's definition was clear: professional boundaries, documented agreements, zero tolerance for renewed manipulation. Bradley's definition apparently involved resuming family accommodations without accounting for his previous betrayal. The tension between those definitions would determine whether this arrangement succeeded or became another lesson in the importance of protecting herself from people who'd already proven their willingness to exploit her kindness. Sunday evening, Margaret sat in her living room reviewing the childcare agreement one final time. Everything was documented. Every boundary was specified. Every protection was in place. Tomorrow, Emma would return to her grandmother's house under circumstances that would have been unimaginable 8 months ago, not as the centerpiece of a happy extended family, but as the beneficiary of a professional service provided by a woman who'd learned the hard way that love without boundaries wasn't sustainable. Margaret Chen was ready. She'd survived financial abuse, legal battles, and family betrayal. She could certainly handle 40 hours a week of professional childcare, even when the child was her beloved granddaughter, and the parent was the son who'd chosen his wife's theft over his mother's dignity. The grandfather clock in her hallway chimed 10 o'clock, marking the end of another day in a life that had been completely reconstructed around the principle that respect was earned, trust was fragile, and boundaries were sacred. Tomorrow would test whether those principles could coexist with the grandmother's love that had never wavered, even when everything else in her family relationships had crumbled under the weight of exploitation and lies. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.